In 2011, an old barn on Maryland's eastern shore was scheduled for demolition. Its doorway was choked with vines, the boards gray and sagging, and the loft hadn't seen a visitor in decades. The owner invited a local man and his young daughter to search the structure for anything worth saving before the bulldozers arrived. What they found in that dark loft had been waiting, untouched, since the Civil War. Climbing into the loft was no easy task. They had to push through brush at the entrance, step over broken floorboards, and duck under low, dusty rafters. Up near the peak of the roof, half hidden among old timbers, they noticed a bundle wrapped in a faded blanket. When they pulled that blanket back, steel and brass glinted in the shafts of light. Inside were two pieces of history: a U.S. Model 1863 Springfield Rifle-Musket and a Model 1840 Noncommissioned Officer's Sword. At first glance, they were simply old weapons, but the markings on their metal surfaces told a much deeper story. On one side of the sword's blade is the name Emerson & Silver, Trenton, New Jersey. This firm produced regulation swords for the Union Army, supplying officers and non-commissioned officers with the sidearms they carried into battle. Flip the blade over and you find U.S. and the date 1963, along with a set of inspector's initials, DFM. Those initials stand for Dexter F. Mosman, an employee of the Ordnance Department whose job was to inspect and accept weapons for federal service. This sword is not a decorative piece. It's a working, regulation, non-commissioned officer's sword, the kind issued to Union Army sergeants to mark their rank and authority. Now look at the rifle-musket. On its lock plate, beneath a federal eagle, are the words U.S. Springfield and the date 1864. That tells us the lock was made at the National Armory and inspected for use late in the war. Taken together, these two weapons paint a clear picture. We're likely looking at the personal arms of a Union sergeant who served during the last years of the Civil War. But who was he? And why were his rifle and sword hidden in the loft of a barn near Preston, Maryland? To answer that, we have to look at the geography and the unit history tied to this small community on the eastern shore. The barn stood near the end of 2 Johns Road in Preston, a tiny community beside the Choptank River in Caroline County. During the Civil War, this quiet area contributed men to a regiment called the 1st Regiment Eastern Shore Infantry, part of the Army of the Potomac. 4 companies of that regiment were mustered in or around Preston. Local men joined what was known as the Preston Section of Company E, drawn from farms and small towns along the river. State archival records for the Preston section list several non-commissioned officers, sergeants, who served there. Any one of them could have carried a sword like this Model 1840 NCO and a Springfield rifle-musket onto the battlefields of Virginia. To narrow it down, we focus on the dates. The sword was accepted into service in 1863, and the rifle lock is dated 1864, so our unknown sergeant was likely in the field from mid-war through the final campaigns. From 1864 onward, the men of this regiment moved through some of the bloodiest fighting of the conflict. They saw action in the tangled forests of the Battle of the Wilderness, then at Spotsylvania Courthouse, including the infamous Bloody Angle, where lines of men fought at point-blank range for hours. They continued through Cold Harbor, a battle remembered for its devastating frontal assaults, then into the long siege of Petersburg, where trench warfare and constant skirmishing wore down both armies. The regiment was present at the Battle of the Crater near Petersburg and later at Five Forks, a key engagement that helped break the Confederate lines. From there, the men joined in the pursuit of Robert E. Lee's army, pushing westward across Virginia. Their march ended at Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee finally surrendered to Grant, and the long war came to a close. Try to imagine one of those sergeants returning home to Preston after all of that. He comes back to the eastern shore, to the fields and waterways he knew before the war. Perhaps the barn near 2 John's Road belonged to him or to his family. He climbs into the loft with his rifle and sword, wraps them in a blanket, and hides them among the rafters. Why hide them? Maybe he wanted to put away the tools of war, to distance himself from the violence they represented. Perhaps he meant to retrieve them later as mementos of his service, but never did. Illness, an early death, or simply the passage of time could have left those weapons forgotten, their story lost to memory. There they remained, rifle and sword, waiting above the barn's dusty floor for roughly 146 years. Generations came and went. The structure decayed. Vines took over the entrance. No one looked up into that particular corner of the loft. Only when the land was about to be cleared for new housing did someone climb up, move that old blanket, and uncover the legacy of a soldier from Preston. Today, when we hold this Springfield Rifle-Musket and this Emerson and Silver NCO sword, we're not just looking at curiosities or collectibles. We're touching the personal equipment of a man who stood in those campaigns, lived through that march from Wilderness to Appomattox, and then tried, somehow, to return to a quieter life along the Choptank River. We may never know his name for certain, but thanks to one overgrown barn and a forgotten blanket in the loft, we can still tell his story. And remember that behind every old weapon or antique object, there was once a human being who carried it into history.